transition progressed, Babangida's concern for reform extended to foreign policy. The OAU summit at Abuja in 1991 was a landmark for his international prestige.
All Nigerians have supported government efforts.
Here and elsewhere, he announced that democracy and the free market were guarantees of stability.
I think that President Babangida must feel that Nigeria and indeed Africa as a whole must be part of the mainstream of the international movement. And there is no denying the fact that internationally now the free market economy is the in thing, and it's not just a matter of fashion but a matter of experience.
Some other African leaders will disagree. They'll argue that rich nations are interfering in the affairs of their countries by demanding reforms. At the United Nations in November 1991, Babangida hammered home his campaigning approach. He now called for debt forgiveness in exchange for economic reform. A lot of people agreed.
If Nigeria were to service its debt, which has risen to the extent that it has now become, it would need to spend over 70% of its export earnings on debt servicing every year. How can you plan for development, for growth in that sort of circumstances?
Babangida was urging rich countries to specifically reward African democracy. He even complained of their apparent indifference.
If this neglect and this indifference continue, disillusionment may arise with democracy in the face of persistent and extreme economic hardship. Aware of this interrelationship between democracy and development, many countries in Africa are pursuing economic reform side by side with the restructuring of the political process.
Ghana, under Jerry Rawlings, was just one of the countries caught on the wave of change, even if there and elsewhere the heads of state would themselves stand for election. Babangida feared that economic hardship might unhinge these new democracies. His concern for political reform extended throughout Africa. In 1992, he'll bring together warring factions in Sudan for peace talks at Abuja. Similarly, he stressed the need for democracy in South Africa. He had long argued for sanctions to end apartheid. So it was no surprise when Nelson Mandela's first visit to West Africa after his release was to Nigeria. April 1992, just 2 years after Mandela's visit, and Babangida welcomes President-de-Klerk to Nigeria. Commentators saw this as an attempt to encourage South Africa towards non-racial elections. Babangida was well placed to exert this influence. He had helped set up talks in Namibia between SWAPO and the South Africans, which had led to elections there. The president also raised the idea of inviting South Africa into the OAU. In the background was the prospect of more trade between two of Africa's largest economies.
I see South Africa remaining important for Nigeria's foreign policy. Not because we are the champions of apartheid, which by then should be dead, but because South Africa can become an important trading partner.
In fact, trade was to be at the heart of Babangida's foreign policy. At the OAU summit in Abuja, leaders signed a treaty to set up the African Economic Community. Babangida, as an advocate of free trade, backed this ambitious plan for a common market. It not only aimed to bring down tariff barriers between African countries, It even proposed an African single currency and central bank within a few decades. Some thought this was all pie in the sky, but many others didn't.
I think, like in every human affair, who was it? Browning, the English poet, who said, a man's reach must be further than his grasp, or else what's heaven for? I think it's much more than a gesture. The African countries realize that they have had very little intra-African trade. They have tended to look outwards. They want now to encourage a greater degree of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, and a much greater degree of trade and business connections within the continent. And that's what motivated the AEC. And I believe that if they are able to pursue that objective vigorously, that it will yet become something quite realizable.
It's rather distant in goal, I would have thought. I think the regional ones at least should be strengthened and made a bit more credible before we then say, okay, from the learning curve of setting up regional ones, maybe we can tackle the continental one. But again, you must understand that what we're talking about is the desire of Africans too to create their own trading blocks, since the rest of the world seems to be doing the same.
One of the AEC's aims was to strengthen groupings like the West African Economic Community, known as ECOWAS. And here, most observers agreed much remained to be done. When not long after the OAU summit, Babangida hosted ECOWAS, many once again asked, why were links between West African countries still so weak? Babangida had always supported ECOWAS. He'd been chairman 3 times, and Nigeria stuck to its tariff agreements. Unfortunately, others didn't. Trade barriers had stayed, and it seemed a shame. Many were optimistic about the idea of ECOWAS as a West African common market.
The prospect is there. Nigeria is presently the leader in the ECOWAS sub-region. So you find out that once you can get to a lot of places in the ECOWAS sub-region through Nigeria. I mean, the economy is not very good in here, but it's picking up. It's picking up, and like I said, Nigeria has that credential of being a leader, of possessing the qualities of a leader in the ECOWAS sub-region. So, for them to invest in Nigeria, it's like investing in the whole of Africa, West Africa.
We are working on an export program, and I must say we're trying to do it in conjunction with ECOWAS. And we're getting support from the Nigerian authorities in this matter, and we think that we might be a lead example within the ECOWAS territory to develop a program with the same objectives of ECOWAS.
But in practice, the problems went deep. Partly, they were due to Nigeria's size compared to neighboring countries. They feared they might be dominated. Many of them had strong ties to France, unlike Nigeria's links to Britain. These obstacles were hard to surmount, so why bother?
We bother with it because I think Nigeria needs ECOWAS, perhaps more than ECOWAS countries will need Nigeria. Once we become an industrial nation, we will have to break the bounds of doing business only in Nigeria. The immediate catchment area is the rest of West Africa.
ECOWAS, when it's fully operational, is going to be mutually beneficial. Nigeria must be prepared to take into this country many ECOWAS citizens who will come here to work on the farms, in the factories, in the services. When Nigeria produces a lot of product for the ECOWAS countries.
In 1991, General Gowon headed an ECOWAS committee to look into its problems and come up with solutions. By the early 90s, ECOWAS had indeed made a bold move which will show how members could work together.